Okay, thank you for the organizer to put our paper into the program. So this is a gazing as Asta, a hysteresis perspective. This is a paper joint Paul Baudry, Katia Kotajova, and the usual disclaimer apply. So those are the views of the authors, not necessarily of the Bank of Canada. So what we want to do in this paper is that, as I think the previous paper discussed, we've seen that there's been a trend decline in the real interest rate over the last 30 years, and this has received a lot of attention. So clearly some explanation that was put forward, I think lower growth, secular stagnation, demographic factors, increase inequality, as well as the shortage of safe asset or the saving glad that Bernanke put forward. But at the same time, during those discussions, you see that many market commentators and also in the policy circle and some researchers suggest that monetary policy may have played a role into that decline of that. In particular, the decline in that trend of the real interest rates has been happening coincided with implementation of inflation targeting regime across advanced economies in particular. There is a recent paper by Francesco Bianchi in the Journal of Finance that estimates that about 2/3 of the decline in the real interest rate since the early 1980s may be due to the shift in the parameters of monetary policy function. So, but at the same time, there's another group that say that this might be a good way to, but the decline in the real interest rate, that trend decline, is really a long-run phenomenon. And that given that money is neutral in the long run, monetary policy is unlikely to play a role into that decline. So what you want to discuss in this paper, that this may not be that a clear cut. So the goal of this paper is to advance the discussion around the potential forces that are weighed down the real interest rate over the last few decades. And we will focus mainly on the role of multiple steady-state real interest rate, and where we provide you a theory and also some empirical evidence to show that why you may want to take that seriously. And we highlight one particular interesting implication of having multiple steady-state real interest rate. So here our the real interest rate here is the R star is the interest rate that are going to clear the asset market in the long run. So what we do specifically here is that first we're going to examine the forces beyond the increase into the wealth to income ratio over the last 30 years in the US. And what we find is that this increase in the wealth to income ratio is mainly due to the weaving group, that of the wealth to income ratio, that is your old age constant, income constant. That increase in the wealth income ratio is driven by the weaving group. And so put it differently, people tend to hold more wealth, but we do not seem to want to get rid of it. So that's basically what we're going to argue. And we're going to provide you a simple framework, a simple overlapping generation framework, like what Anton will discuss, where the saving decision is going to be influenced by two factors. So basically the retirement motives, that Anton just discussed, but also the intertemporal substitution motives. And we're going to show that if you have these two forces, this may lead to a C-shaped asset demand, a steady-state asset demand in the real interest rate. In particular, this happens when the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is less than 1. And the key insight for this is this can lead to more than one real interest rate that's going to equate the long-run asset demand and the long-run asset supply. And the interest rate are going to emerge from this, that's going to call R star, that's in the real economy. And we take this economy and look at the monetary policy implication in that environment. So what we find is that even if you assume that monetary policy is neutral in the long run, if you assume that, we can show that monetary policy, in fact, can affect the set of feasible steady-state real interest rate that can emerge. It will also affect the stability properties of those steady state, as well as the basin of attraction. In particular, we show that an aggressive monetary policy regime can make the high real rate equilibrium more fragile to negative inflation shock, and will favor the convergence to the low real rate interest rate environment. And our final result is that in this case, you can have a large inflation shock or a large increase in public debt can help escape the low inflation and low real rate interest rate trap that we have here. So let's give you a quick outline about what we're going to, for the remaining of the discussion. First, I'm going to go briefly into the composition of the wealth to income ratio over the last 30 years, present you a simple framework that can give us a rise to this long run, the C-shaped long run asset demand, put that in a general equilibrium framework, consider the case where it's a flexible price, so no nominal rigidities, and then we add nominal rigidities to look at the impact of inflation. And I won't have time here, but we also extend the model to include some look-through in order to study the valuation effects. And the main result will be unchanged that I just discussed with you. So I will skip the literature for time constraint. Let's go straight to the decomposition. So what we do here, we will decompose the change in the wealth income ratio by using the shift share analysis. So we're going to decompose the increase in wealth to income ratio between the within group, that is your old age constant, and old income constant. We'll do that also between group, which is the composition effect. In that case, that's going to be the distribution of income or the distribution of age changing. For that, we're going to use the survey of consumer finance, and for 1989 to 2019. We're going to consider 30 age group. That's going to be the product of 5 age group times 6 income group. And what we find is that the increase in wealth income ratio over the last 30 years, that coincides with the decrease in the real interest rate, is account for more than 60% of that increase. And the remaining is coming from the between effect. That's the composition effect here. And we do different sensitive analysis in terms of defining the different wealth, including pension, and the result is still maintained. So now the question is, why we see this increase, this importance in the wealth income ratio to explain that? There could be two interpretations. The first one is that there is an increase in the wealth income ratio because the real interest rate has been lower. There's a lower return on asset. The second one could be that there is an increase that comes from an anticipated increase that due to valuation effect. Because when the interest rate decrease, that increases the value of asset. So in order to discriminate between these two possibilities, you look at the changes in the within group saving over the same period. And for that, we're going to use the definition for well-based synthetic approach. And what we show here is that there is a small positive correlation between the within group change on the saving rate in the within group, and if you look at the change in the wealth income ratio, the correlation is basically small. We look at different definitions, it could be even negative, but very negative, small. So what this tells you that household group that face greater increase in the wealth income ratio do not appear to systematically reverse the accumulation of the asset that they have. If you were to see that, you will see a decrease in the saving rate, and that's not, we are not seeing that.
Did you account for housing in this?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying earlier. We account for housing. In the definition, we have different robustness. We take out housing, we include housing, and the result is still maintained.
So housing is a liability as much as so that might explain that your savings rate doesn't react to changes in the price.
No, so we can see that if the interest rate increases, the valuation of asset of housing can be higher. So that might be, since may be difficult, housing lumpy, may be difficult for you to not get rid of it, but to sell your house. It could be some transaction cost. So that's the reason why we subtract the housing on that. So yeah, we did different robustness in the analysis here. So any other question on the data before? So what you want to conclude from this is that this notion, this support the fact that we see that there's been an increase in the wealth income ratio, and we think this is due to mainly the women group. This kind of support the notion that the women group in wealth income ratio is likely to reflect the desire of household holding as opposed to something is excess. That's basically what you want to show here. So we now bring us to the model. The question is that why you may want household to hold more asset when asset to return are lower? That's really the question. I think Anton just touched on that in his presentation here. But before I go into the, well, I can give you a sample quote here, if that was not really the motivation of the paper. But Raghu Rajan in 2013, as a former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, just to quote him, he said that savers put more money aside as interest rates fall in order to meet the saving they think they will need when they retire. So we will take these views seriously. There are definitely many ways to address it. It can be precautionary motives. It can be bequest motives, so that can help that. But for us, we're going to take a simple environment that can deliver that increase in the women group asset. So the economy is populated by a continuum of overlapping generation, similar as Blanchard in 1985 and Gertler in 1989. And a household can be in three states. We can have an active, we can be active, or we can be a worker. We can retire, or we can die. And households start in the active state, and we can transit out of that state with a probability delta 1. And we will think of this shock as a health shock, So at this transition with a probability Q, the person retire with probability 1 minus Q. And the health shock here, if it's severe, the person will die. If one person retire, he will also die with probability delta 2 that's greater than delta 1. So let's go through the retirees problem actually briefly. Just to show you, this is a simple framework here, is that the retiree is going to maximize discounted utility subject to a budget constraint. And the main point here is that the retiree is going to have going to live only on asset income, so which is RT80. And when you take the Euler equation, you can now get the value in retirement. And the value in retirement will depend on the asset at the time of retirement. It will also depend on the path of interest rate. This is gamma T. This gamma T is going to capture the path of the real interest rate that you value as an individual. And one thing here is that if the interest rate was constant, what you're going to see is that you get this value in the following form. This comes, one of the first results in lemma 1 is that if interest rate is fixed, in that case, the marginal value of asset to a retiree is going to be decreasing in real interest rate. In other words, is that when the interest rate is low, you want to accumulate more asset. So this is coming from this simple problem here. So here you live on your retirement income, and this is conditional on sigma b greater than 1. Yeah, that's not important. Sigma being greater than 1. So now let's take the activation agent problem. It maximizes expected discount utility, but now it's going to take into account the value in retirement. And we will retire probability, we survive probability delta 1, we retire probability Q. So here the budget constraint is a maximum subject to budget constraint. The only difference here is that it's going to have also labor income. That's come from WT. If we take a maximization problem and you get the following Euler equation. So on the right-hand side, you have two terms. You have a standard intertemporal substitution effect that comes, so when interest rate is high, you want to postpone consumption and save more. But now you have also the second term, which is now going to capture the retirement motives. And this term is positive. This red term is positive. This means that it puts pressure to postpone consumption in the future. So if you take a model of bequest, that you have money in utility function, non-money asset in utility function, you will get similar things. But one difference here is that these depend on the path of interest rate. And it depends on the path of interest that are given by gamma t. And so as I showed you earlier, the value in retirement, if when interest rate is low, you want to postpone, you want to save more. So you're going to balance these two effects to get the intertemporal substitution and the income and this income effect that you're going to of interest. You're going to balance these two effects. So when you balance that, you're going to derive the asset demand explicitly here. The asset to income ratio is going to be given by this equation here. And in this, we show here that if sigma is greater than 1, the asset to income ratio is going to be a C shape. So the vertical line is the interest rate, and then horizontal line is the asset to income ratio. So two things to note here. We can show that there is going to be a R bar that comes from a model. If the interest rate is above R bar, the intertemporal substitution will dominate. So in that case, increasing interest rate is going to increase in asset to income ratio. But when the interest rate is below R bar, so interest rate is low, the income effect of the interest rate dominates. Your saving motive becomes much more prevalent. So you want to accumulate more asset to fulfill for retirement need. And here the interest rate can be negative, so this term can be negative here. So that's like what Anton just discussed. So here, from this simple framework I just discussed, is that you have here the possibility of a C-shaped environment. So this kind of show that the asset demand is not monotonic in the real interest rate. So what I'm going to do now, take that environment, put that in a general equilibrium with a government that's going to spend, tax, and also issue bond. For simplicity here, I'm going to assume that the bond is fixed. And there's tax, but tax is lump sum. There's a central bank. And I'm going to start with flexible price. And this is going to give, I'm going to show the multiple satisfied real interest rate. And after, I will introduce nominal rigidities and a Phillips curve that is going to be subject to also with Taylor rule. And I look at my experiments. So let's look at the model with flexible price, no nominal rigidities. I just told you that the asset supply is fixed, so the asset supply here is vertical. So because of this C shape, you have these two possible interest rates here. So you have the high real interest rate in a steady state that is above R bar, and then you have another one that is R star L, that is the lower, is below R bar. So a unique equilibrium is not possible here. You can have one that's unique in the sense that at the tangent, but it's not going to be about a small modification. So this I just show you that with a nominal friction in this environment, with a nominal friction, we have possibility of two real interest rate, that we call it two in the steady state. So for now, let's now look at monetary policy. So for that, we will introduce some nominal rigidities, and we have a Phillips curve, and we also a monetary policy rule that's going to play a role here. But the key that is subject to a zero lower bound, and with psi here is going to be, when I say monetary policy is aggressive, I'm going to vary this with psi. And the Taylor principle will hold when the ELB constraint is non-binding. So let's go through the result. So first, let's look at the case where monetary policy is not that aggressive, but it still satisfies the Taylor principle. In this case, so on this graph, what you want to see here is that the this curve that mirror each other is basically consumption C dot equals 0 as a function of inflation. So when it's below PLB, it means that the ELB constraint is binding. It's above PLB, it means that the constraint is not binding. The ELB constraint is not binding. And the horizontal line here is the Phillips curve at the steady state. So the steady state equilibrium here is going to be given by the intersection of these two curves. So what we see from this graph is that now we have only one full employment stable steady state equilibrium. And that's going to be given by the point E1 in the graph. At that equilibrium, the real interest is going to be the high real interest rate. And the inflation is going to be our target. So now we have a second equilibrium. And that equilibrium is on the ELB's zone. But that equilibrium is not stable in the sense of saddle. And so we have an environment where we have stability at the ELB, at the non-ELB, and instability in the non-ELB. This is kind of similar to what Benabi, Shimin, Grohe, and Rube have done. So that is the case when monetary policy is not very aggressive, but continue to satisfy the Taylor principle. So let's now increase the aggressiveness of monetary policy. So what will happen now? Now we're going to have two stable steady states. And we still have E1, which is the one with high real interest rate. Now you have a second one, which is given by point E2. And this is going to be in the ELB zone. And the interest rate, that the real interest rate here is going to be the low real interest rate, R star L. And the inflation is going to be minus R star L. So the question is why we see that emerge, why we have now this new equilibrium emerging when monetary policy becomes more aggressive. So when monetary policy becomes more aggressive, one thing happens is that the range of real interest rate increase because at the ELB zone, monetary policy is going to be real interest rate decrease in inflation. So that's when it's going to be a higher, the constraint is going to bind at a higher level of inflation. So the range of the real interest will increase, so it's likely to capture the low R star that is available there. That's really why we get the second equilibrium, 10 minutes. And so the second point I want to also to look at is in this nominal economy, you have also the stability of this economy will depend on endogenous dynamics in the model. But they're going to work very differently depending on which steady state you are in. So let's say, for example, you are the steady state with high real interest rate. In that zone, let's say that inflation is high, monetary policy is going to react by increasing the nominal interest rate, but because the Taylor principle hold, the real interest rate will also increase. So the real interest rate increasing because in this zone, the intertemporal substitution dominate, the inflation will go down. And if you are in this zone, so this becomes locally stable, so endogenously. If you are in the zone E2, like the same thing happen. Because inflation being high, the real interest will decrease. But in real interest will decreasing, we know that the income effect of the interest will dominate here. So people want to postpone consumption and save more. So demand will go down and inflation increase. So you get the stability of these 2 points in this case. And finally, in this point is that the fact that you have two steady states that are stable, you have possibility of hysteresis. So where you start will matter here. If you are above pi tilde, you will converge to the high real interest rate and high inflation. If you are below pi tilde, you will converge to the low real interest rate. So let's look at now the fragility of a high real interest rate. For that, we're going to look at in the space of nominal interest rate and inflation. So this is a graph also in Benabi and Shiminguru that's very intuitive. So here we have two lines. The two lines are basically the Fisher equation with steady state. So the first one is the one real interest rate is higher, and one interest rate is lower. So if there was only one real interest, one R star, you're going to only one line here. So let's now add to this the Taylor rule. So that's the blow on here. And I'm going to, the equilibrium E1 I just described is going to be the intersection between the different curves. And so the zone of attraction here is going of a high real interest rate is going to be anything above pi tilde, and the basin of attraction is going to be anything above below I tilde for R star L, for low real interest rate. I'm going to call this one panel B. So let's now increase the aggressive or monetary policy. So what this one means is that it's like moving from panel B to panel C. The only difference here is that the curve, you have now the green curve is going to have a steeper slope. So it means that monetary policy is more aggressive. So few things I want you to know, two things. The first one is that when interest rate increases, we see that the zone of attraction of the high interest rate becomes smaller. So you can see from the graph, when you move from this red arrow, left-right arrow, to panel C, is shrinking. So this suggests that tell you that the high real interest will become very sensitive to small negative inflation shock. So it becomes less robust, it becomes fragile. That's what you have in this case. The second point I wanted to also to see is that when the monetary become more aggressive, at the same time, the zone of attraction of the low real interest rate increase. So you see that from this graph, from panel B to panel C, in the black arrow there, become larger. That zone become larger. So the question is, how can you get out of this low real interest rate? So we could have, I'm going to consider two cases. One is increasing the amount of debt. The amount of debt in this economy can help escape this low real interest rate. But in our environment, it's going to also lead to a jump in the real interest rate and also a jump in inflation. And I'm going to, but let's spend more time here because you see that more policy relevant at what you're going through now. So let's now suppose we're going to see how inflation shock will help get out of this low interest rate environment. So what we show here is that let's assume that you are in an environment where you are at equilibrium E2, which is the low real interest rate and low inflation. I just show you that equilibrium is very robust to shocks. Let's assume that there's a large inflation shock delta that moves the inflation above the inflation target. So this will move you to the equilibrium, the point A, from point E2 to point A on this graph. And the inflation is going to be given by ELB minus R star plus delta. So when you are in this zone, what will happen? Monetary policy, we see high inflation, monetary policy is going to react. So we're going to increase the nominal interest rate. So increasing the nominal interest rate means that because in this zone, the intertemporal substitution dominate, the real interest rates go down, and in some sense, central bank creates a temporal recession, and we converge back to the high real interest rate. But we're not going to converge back to the low real interest rate because of the hysteresis in this environment. So what this paper seems to suggest that a large inflation shock is what you are seeing now, can help move out of a low inflation environment to a high inflation environment. So let me conclude. So when we are thinking about R star, we in general, we focus on slow-moving forces such as demographics, productivity, or income inequality. So in such case, we can debate whether the past trend that we've seen could reverse soon, but if this were to be the case, it's likely to be slow-moving and is unlikely to be affected by the current inflation, the high inflation that we are seeing now. So what this paper suggests is that the economy, in fact, could throw another curveball, in the sense that if there is more than one R star, due, for example, to the C-shaped asset demand that we have, then a reversal of the past real interest rate could arise in a much more surprising and endogenous fashion in this environment. In particular, a large increase in public debt can give you a discontinued jump in R star, and also that a large inflation shock, as we see now, could move economy away from the low R star to an environment where to a high R star basin of attraction. That's what I have. Thanks.
Thank you very much for allowing me to discuss this interesting paper and important contribution. So to put things in perspective, I mean, quite a lot is going on. So to put things in perspective, I will really start from the basics. So from the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So I'm just reversing the axis compared to the figures that Césaire has just shown. So now, like, as this traditional, like, output or consumption is on the horizontal axis and inflation is on the vertical axis. Now the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, nothing interesting, and you have the aggregate demand curve. Now what's important is that the interest rate falls as you move right along the aggregate demand curve. So basically as inflation falls, because the Taylor rule, the nominal interest rate falls more than 1 for 1, therefore the real interest rate falls and aggregate demand expands. So that's traditional, just, you know, the working of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And at some point you have an equilibrium. So the interest rate, so as inflation falls, the nominal interest rate falls, and at some point, you hit the zero lower bound, and once you hit the zero lower bound, then further decreases in inflation leads to an increase in the real interest rate, and therefore aggregate demand starts expanding. And so you end up with two equilibrium possibility. One equilibrium with a positive nominal interest rate. That's the equilibrium that is saddle path stable with normal properties. And you have another equilibrium with a binding zero lower bound. So in the original contribution of Martin and co-author, this is a sink, this equilibrium. In Césaire's paper, it's an unstable equilibrium. Now, I think it would be interesting to know exactly how robust it is to know whether in your framework it is unstable rather than a sink. In a footnote, you mentioned it is because of backward-looking expectation. In one of my papers, I have backward-looking expectation, and this is also a sink. So anyway, we can agree that the equilibrium with a binding zero lower bound does not have desirable properties, and so we should focus on the other one. Now, what is the paper of this? What is this paper about? Well, this paper is about the assumption that aggregate demand is decreasing in the real interest rate. Maybe it is increasing in the real interest rate. And what is its story for that? Well, basically, it's a simple story about the income and substitution effect. And so at some point when the interest rate falls, well, people need to save more in order to match their income from capital goal. And so when the interest rate becomes very low, then then aggregate demand becomes increasing in the real interest rate. So now along the aggregate demand curve, the real interest rate falls, and then the real interest rate falls, and at some point as the real interest rate falls, well, people save more, and aggregate demand contracts. And so now you have not one, but two equilibrium with a positive nominal interest rate, and then if the nominal interest rate further falls, then you have a binding zero lower bound again, and so the real interest rate starts increasing, and so you have two more equilibrium possibilities. Now, except that the stability properties are reversed, the equilibrium with an upward sloping aggregate demand curve is unstable if you're not at the zero lower bound, but it is stable at the zero lower bound. And so you are left with these two equilibrium. Either you have a high real interest rate equilibrium with a positive nominal interest rate, and that is stable, or you have a binding zero lower bound with a low real interest rate, and that is also stable. So these are the two equilibrium possibilities, and so basically this paper is about showing this new equilibrium possibility that we see in this picture. Now, with this framework, endowed with this framework, the paper investigates a number of policy scenarios. One result is that here the market structure is non-Ricardian, so if you have an increase in public debt, then you have an increase in aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand curve can shift to the right with more public debt, and that makes the high real interest rate equilibrium unique again. Another thing that they investigate is monetary policy. So they have the Taylor rule, which is written here at the top. We know the Fisher identity, that the real interest rate is the nominal rate net of inflation. Now, if you combine these two equations, just, nothing, no trick, just combine these two equations, you obtain this lower bound for the real interest rate. Now, one thing they emphasize is that the lower bound for the real interest rate is increasing in psi, the coefficient of the Taylor rule. So if psi is close to, if psi is very high, then the lower bound, if psi is very high, the lower bound is very low, and that makes it more likely that you have the low real interest rate equilibrium. If psi is close to 1, then the low real interest rate equilibrium is not an option. And you can see it graphically. So basically, the black curve was the original curve. Then if I decrease psi, so maybe that psi was like 2, 3, 4, I don't know. And then I take up psi that is very close to 1, just 1.1, 1.2. That means that the Taylor rule is not very responsive to inflation. And so as inflation falls, well, the nominal interest rate only falls slightly more than 1 for 1. The real interest rate only falls very slightly. And so basically, I get demand does not shift very much. That's a blue curve. And very rapidly, you're going to hit the zero bound. And then you're going to have the other part of the curve without allowing for the possibility of the low real interest rate equilibrium. Now, a number of remarks or questions that I have from this analysis. So first, one thing that could be emphasized, which I think is interesting from a policy perspective, is that you actually make a fairly strong case for an asymmetric Taylor rule, where the psi parameter should be high, very high if inflation is above target, but very low, close to 1 if inflation is below target. And that's maybe something related to current monetary policy practices. Now, having said that, I think it raises an important question that is not addressed at all in the paper, which is the welfare implication of the analysis. I mean, we have two steady states, both of them with like full employment, one with a high real interest rate, one with a low interest rate, real interest rate. It is assumed throughout that it's better to be in the high real interest rate equilibrium. Well, probably because it's better to be out of the zero bound and to have, just more standard. But I think a welfare analysis would be warranted here to really justify aiming for one equilibrium rather than the other. Another remark I had was more related to the empirical motivation at the beginning. So I found the empirical section less convincing because, I mean, interesting, but probably less convincing because of the difficulty of identification. But if I think about the story, basically what is the empirical section saying? The empirical section is saying, just let's control for age, let's control for income, and we observe that people save more, even though the real interest rate is lower, and that suggests that the real interest rate, the demand for saving is, they save more, even though, so the demand for saving is increasing in the real interest rate. But then that story has to do with, it really has to do with demographic. And so if the fall in aggregate demand, which is caused by a lower interest rate, is due to household saving for retirement, then we would expect this saving to take place after retirement. And I think the big surprise over the past 10, 15 years is that, yes, I mean, Japan was saving a lot because there was population aging, people were planning for retirement. But once people retire, they keep saving. And that is a big surprise. And I think that's somewhat fundamentally inconsistent with the motivation is provided in terms of retirement savings. I would tend to interpret what has happened as a strong bequest motive. So once people are in retirement, they want to save more. That's maybe beyond the scope of the paper, but I think it's something important to have in mind when we think about this issue. And then finally, in my discussion, I thought I should contrast this framework with secular stagnation. I spent most of my time working on secular stagnation. So how is the low real interest rate equilibrium related to secular stagnation? Well, in fact, in this framework, you can easily have secular stagnation. What you need is a nonlinear Phillips curve. And so at some point, basically, you need to introduce a downward nominal wage rigidity or something like this that's going to flatten out the aggregate supply curve. And then you have a new equilibrium possibility, which is a dot, which is a lower dot. Now, it's very different. It looks superficially, it may look a little bit like the new low real interest rate equilibrium you're showing, because both of them have a binding zero lower bound on the nominal interest rate. But they're very different. Because I remember that, like, I have no pointer if I have a pointer. At this point, the real interest rate is the same as at this point. And basically here, the real interest rate is even higher. So the story about secular stagnation is that we have a binding zero lower bound, but the real interest rate is too high as a result. Maybe in Japan, for the past few years, it was like zero nominal interest rate, zero inflation, that means a zero real interest rate. And according to the secular stagnation hypothesis, that's too high. We would have needed a real interest rate of -2, -3, -4%. And so I think the story of secular stagnation implies that the current real interest rate is constrained to be too high, which is very different from the low real interest rate story that you're giving. Just a remark to put things in perspective. But I think it's a very interesting paper that thought stimulating and yeah, very nice to read. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Any question? Yes, please. Yeah.
How do you consider exploring optimal monetary policy in your framework? Because then that becomes some questions about how a shock that moves you movement from one steady state to the other, what's the optimal design of monetary policy, how are the transition, which is the optimal long-run steady state of the two.
Any other question? Yeah.
Just a clarifying question, Césaire. So something that I don't get. So you get out of this low R equilibrium if you increase the debt, so the supply of assets. Now I understand, you know, the Ricardian motive. So I saw this paid by the future generation, so I'll get increases, which is what we're discussing. But normally in these models, in steady state, the real interest rate is endogenous, is determined by the supply of assets and the demand of assets. So I would intuitively think that when you increase the supply of assets, the real interest rate would fall in steady state. But it's increasing, you know, result.
Okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, so maybe let me start, and then if there's more question, I will, yeah, thank you, Jean-Baptiste, for a very good discussion. Yeah, actually, this the graph where you do an aggregate demand, aggregate supply, I think this is a very good way to present it. So the graphical, I think it's one good way to go. Regarding the, I think your point on the stability, there I think the issue is here you are using a backward-looking Phillips curve. So if you were to use a forward-looking component, what will happen here is that the equilibrium will flip. So the one that is stable, it becomes stable, but it becomes determinate, and the other one is stable saddle, but it becomes indeterminate. So we have in fact we show that in the previous version of the paper, but it's become longer and longer. So it's on our website. So that's one. In fact, you got that question several times. So thank you for that. And yeah, having a monetary policy to be symmetric, that's something to be considered. We haven't done it at this stage yet, but it gives us a possibility, in particular, through what Alton will just present. Maybe that could be something to look at, but we haven't done it. Regarding the welfare analysis, yeah. So here, welfare is definitely one thing that you could do, but we are not doing at this stage. We see this work more as positive analysis that we try to do. Is that you want to find a way that to give a rationale why it may be monetary policy may play a role for now. I think the next stage is probably to look at the normative assessment here. And in this overlapping generation, defining welfare is a little bit more complicated. So here you can think that, in fact, the old people are likely to be the most affected. They won't like the low real interest rate because they have to decrease consumption a lot to fulfill for the next. So that's another thing that depends how we define it. But we are not assuming you are not assuming anywhere that you prefer the high real interest rate. We are not assuming that. We just please go. Yeah.
Presumably the two equilibria are not Pareto rankable.
Yeah, that's.
The savers prefer high R and the borrowers prefer low R.
Yeah. And that's kind of why we think at this stage we want to stay on the positive side than the normative side.
But you often, in the paper, you often discuss how to get to the high interest rate equilibrium.
How do you escape? How do you escape a low environment that you are into? It's more kind of a policy question than a thing. But you are not, yeah. But it's definitely a good point.
So who would prefer the low R environment?
The young will prefer it, but the one thing for clear in this environment, the old people won't like it because they have to save. When interest rates is low, because of the income effect, they have to increase. We have to have higher. We have to save more to fulfill that. So again, that's exactly the reason why I don't want to do welfare at this stage yet, because of all the consideration that you are exactly bringing out at this stage yet. That we don't want to do at this stage yet.
Relative to labor income, liabilities and consumption is backloaded. So wouldn't everybody prefer a high interest rate?
Not necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily. You don't have labor. Labor is inelastic in this.
Yeah, but is there physical capital in the production function?
No, here production is basically in the real economy, it's endowment economy, but in the nominal economy, the production depends on linearly on employment. But no, you don't have capital. You don't have capital in this economy. You don't have capital.
There were capital, the high arm might harm the young,
yeah,
because wages would be lower, there's less capital.
Yeah, you don't have capital. Yeah, again, that's one of the reasons that at this stage, let's not go on the welfare because all these difficult questions to go through. In terms of the explanation of why we see saving in Japan, so I think here in our environment, demographic factor is definitely one thing, one that can explain it, but we're not saying what you are showing here that's the only reason why we see increase in saving. It could be bequest and fast. The first version of this paper was on bequest. And we did that, and the referee did not like it. They want us to do something else, and that's why we have retirement, because it was more natural. So that's basically why we get. But bequest was the main motive, because we are thinking of Japan. So for you, when B increases, the low R star decrease. You know, we expect the low R star decrease. Yeah, so that's why we get it. We don't. Yeah, that's why we have the low R star decrease, and. Yeah, optimal policy, we haven't done optimal policy yet, so that's something to consider. Thank you. Sorry.